Hey everyone, welcome to this workshop. Doing this a little bit online and hopefully a little bit in person as well, depending on what's happening with restrictions. But what I want to do is kind of just go over this Google slide presentation that I put together because it gives a pretty good outline of the kind of stuff I want to talk about, but also talking about it and explaining a few of the things helps you to understand it a little bit more in detail. Um, Cody first talked to me about presenting my work to you and the kind of process that I've been using. And as I was thinking about it, I realized that it kind of ties into a lot of different major aspects that a teacher of any subject these days needs to be aware of when you're teaching internationally or even just domestically, depending on the kind of school that you're in. And one of the big parts of that is this concept of STEAM. And STEAM is an outgrowth of STEM, which is science, technology, engineering, and math, which are considered to have, for a long time, were considered to be the kind of core academics as part of any kind of education. But there's been a big push to include the arts as part of that for a lot of different obvious reasons. The creativity, particularly, but also different approaches, but not just as an add on, really as a part of the process. And so, what I want to do as I'm going through this is explain how that happens and how STEM and STEAM actually are not opposed. They work together and they can work together really strongly with the ultimate aim of increasing students' learning and helping them be more creative. So I'm going to be talking about the kind of artwork that I've been working on lately. I've done a lot of work in various mediums, but I've come upon this technique with different metals and household products to get a really cool result. And I've kind of dovetailed it into a few different concepts and themes. You're going to be seeing all these images a little bit later and kind of what's behind them. But I just kind of want to show you visually the kind of stuff that I'm going to be referring to as we go through. And the thing to keep in mind as we're going through this, you don't need to be artistic in any way in order to produce the kind of work that we're talking about. Obviously, I have a background in art, and I've been doing it for a long time. But that doesn't preclude you from trying out these kind of exercises and kind of processes. They're actually a lot of fun. So I'm going to go over these seven main areas, you guys. A little bit of about my background, the whole concept of project-based learning, which we do in the arts a lot. And I know you're probably familiar with standard-based assessment and standard-based mindset, but that plays into this a lot, and talk about that and how actually it makes your life much easier as a teacher on a lot of levels. And then, like I referred to before, STEAM and STEM, and how the two of them kind of dovetail together. And then, in terms of designing a project or a unit, the idea of understanding by design and backward by design, which we'll be talking about. And then also ABAR, anti-bias and anti-racism, is a huge issue in the world these days and in international education. So that's something that I'm trying to incorporate, and I have been trying to incorporate. Actually, I do it in other project with my students at school, but with this particular kind of body of work that I'm working with right now. And then the very pragmatic, practical aspect at the end of how to plan a project and how to implement it with what we're doing right now. So a little bit about my background. I'm Canadian, but I actually have three nationalities. I also have Irish nationality and Spanish. But I've been teaching for over 40 years now. I started teaching in 1979. And my first degree was a Bachelor of Education in Physical Education, and with a major in PE and a minor in Sciences. So I do have a science background. It's not really strong. It's been a lot of years. But when actually I was collaborating with a couple of the science and chemistry teachers at the school where I'm teaching here in Madrid, at the American School of Madrid, I actually was able to understand what the teachers were talking about in terms of compounds and different chemical procedures that happen. So I was in physical education for a long time, and then I switched to the arts, although I've been always involved in the arts kind of on an amateur level. But I got my master's through Antioch University in the States, and then did my actual coursework in Florence, Italy, through a studio there called Charles H. Cecil Studio, and then switched to teaching art as well. So I've taught in a lot of different international and American schools. primarily in Egypt and Spain. I spent about 13 years in Egypt and now maybe 13, 14 years in Spain, but also a handful of other places as well, as you can see here. And I kind of straddled between being a professional artist and a hobby artist. My main income has always been as a teacher and working in schools, and I love teaching. But I've also been fortunate enough to make some sales to corporations and private sales, and had a number of different exhibitions in various places. So my art background is actually quite strong as well. And here's a couple of QR codes if you're interested. Take a look at my work. And both my Instagram and the website and my Facebook are all just basically art. So when we're looking at planning a year and also planning a unit or planning a project, there's two basic ways to do it, and it's not that they are in conflict with each other, but I think the second one, standard-driven project-based learning, is kind of an outgrowth. It was grown out of component-driven, and I started off teaching component-driven, and I'll go over that right now. But then, as international schools and myself have shifted to standard-based mindset and standard-driven project-based learning, I realized I was already doing it before, anyways. So here's a really good example of what I used to do in terms of setting up. This was for, I think, middle school or upper elementary school art projects. So this was kind of what I set up for their first 7 projects that they were going to be doing in the class. It's like a long-term semester or trimester plan. And what I would do is break down what are the main kind of components that should be gone over if you're talking about a general arts program for kids in elementary or middle school. And for me, they're the elements of art, the principles of design, all along the left side there. What kind of historical or cultural theme are you looking at? What's the purpose or function of what you're doing? And then the kind of the medium or the component area that you're looking at, and the style or the aesthetic and format. And there's various other ones you could put in there as well, but I did it intentionally. I did 7 down and 7 across so that I could do this kind of grid setup for it. So the very first project, for example, if you take a look at the top, it's a painted movie poster. I didn't decide that I was going to do a poster and then figure out which one of those components fit into it. What I did was, as you look along across from each one of those, so for example, the elements of art, we've got color, line, shape, space, form, value, texture, and the same thing goes along for each of those rows. So the principles of design can be unity, movement, pattern, emphasis, balance or tension, contrast, rhythm, and of course, again, with all of those, you could have more or less in there, depending on what your background is and how you're defining different aspects of each of these categories. But at some point, you just decide, okay, I'm going to kind of qualify it as this, and then continue with that. And the same with cultural, historical themes or areas to look at, and all the rest of them follow that. So the kind of approach I used to take, in other words, these were the components that were driving what the project was going to be, which is really what this idea of backward by design is. And I was doing it a long time before I actually knew that I was doing it. So for example, let's take a look at those first 4: a painted movie poster, a Thai temple, an Islamic design of some kind, and then prehistoric cave construction and painting. So the idea or the approach with all of these is that, okay, if I'm trying to do this, I want it to be cartoon-like, I want it to be painting, commercial, then what kind of project could cover all of those aspects? And so that's where I would come up with each of those separate projects. And here's some examples. So the painted movie poster, it includes all of those aspects that we're talking about. And one other additional thing I did with them was talking about, in terms of context, looking for an artist or a cartoonist style that you like, and make the cartoon poster in the style of that artist rather than in the style of the actual movie. It was a movie poster thing. So you can see that, Friends, for example, the TV show poster for the TV show Friends, but they've done it in the style of the cartoonist from the Flintstones. The same thing, the idea with the Thai temple. Each of the aspects of this project tie into those 7 different categories that I'm trying to target with the kids, and the same thing for the next couple as well. And so the idea behind this is that once I would get through the first 7 projects with the kids, at least they would have had a general kind of overview and exposure to all the major components in each of those 7 different categories. So at least in one sense, the feeling is, all right, they're getting, it's not a really in-depth exposure to what art can be, but they get a general overview of the kind of things that make up art. So that was component driven. But so now if we look at standard driven, every subject area has what are called standards. And I'm sure you're aware of that. And we have them in visual arts, and in sciences, they have them as well in all different subjects. And so what this is, this example that I'm putting here, one of the classes that I teach is in upper school or high school, it's 3D computer animation. We use software called Maya, which is pretty well the industry standard. And before shifting to kind of a standards-based mindset, what I used to do was create set projects for the kids. For example, this first initial unit is about navigation and getting used to the user interface, and then basic modeling and lighting and texturing and stuff. But so what I've done with this though is I've done it in a different way. Here are our 5 different standards in visual arts, and they're depending on the school that you're at and the system that is being used, most of them they all kind of dovetail. They're pretty well similar. So the creative process, elements of art and principles of design, critiquing, context, and then skills and techniques. And these are the areas that within the project, the kids are focusing on. And they're also the areas that they're being assessed on. They're learning in each of these 5 areas. So they're working on one project, but at the same time, they're really working on 5 different aspects of their learning, these 5 different areas here. And so they're aware, for example, and this is a bit of a more of a breakdown in terms of how each one of those is broken down and what they can be, what they need to be doing in order to show that they have advanced their skills and they have learned in each of these 5 different areas. And then they end up presenting this at the end. So here's an example of one of the students. It was not the same class as that project was, but the idea is exactly the same. Here's an example, an exemplar, a kind of a master level exemplar of a student who then presented her learning after going through this project. And so what she's done, and the idea that I try to get the students to do, is she's broken down her learning into those 5 different standard areas. And so here she's got them here. Behind my head there, I think, is critiquing. So there's creative process, elements and principles, skills, context, and critiquing. And the 6th one would be development, which are things like group work skills and effort and that kind of stuff, which is no longer a standard in visual arts. It's now dovetailed into being approaches to learning, or ATLs. So anyway, she talks about here her creative process, what her goals were, and the concept and the idea, her plan, and then the kind of problem solving she had to go through, or the changes that she made from her original plan. She set out in terms of organization. So creative process, we talk about being planning, organizing, and problem solving. So here you can see she was very organized in terms of when she was going to do what on what certain days, what her plan was, and then the reality of what really happened. And then along with that, she talks about the problems that she came up with and how she worked with those problems. And we talk to the students that you can't always solve problems, but you can work with them. And she's done a really good in-depth job here talking about what are the elements of art that she used and what were the principles of design, and which elements of art did she use for those principles, as she's got graphed out here. And then she's also divided her skills and techniques up to a very, very detailed way in terms of hardware as well as software, as well as working procedures. And all of them kind of tie into there. With context, we talk about resources and inspiration and sources and tutorials and what other artists are doing in the field, in the greater world of whatever it is they're working on. In this case, 3D computer animation. So you can see that she's had some inspiration from things that she saw on the internet, And then she's even done a timeline in terms of when she studied what, when she got influenced. And so here we see that now the actual visual aspects of it. And these are all of these visuals are part of the creative process, because part of the creative process, those three main areas are planning, organizing, and problem solving. And part of that process involves organizing your time so you finish the project in time as well. And so she's got her finished work here. Very nice job she did. And then critiquing. So when we talk about critiquing, we're talking about what areas they were successful, what areas were challenging or difficult, and what they would change or improve or do over again if they had a chance to start again from the beginning. So she did that on a daily basis, and then she also did it as kind of a general overall approach as well. So very, very in-depth there. So that's a really good example of a standard-based mindset. And so when we're looking at science, chemistry specifically, and art, painting specifically, science and visual arts both have standards. And at the American School of Madrid, where I am, these are the standards for science that we have, and these cover all the science courses. So constructing explanations, designing and carrying out investigation, analyzing data, and communicating information. And looking at these standards and looking at this project that I'm working with here, I thought, okay, what are two of them that I think could really fit into this project that we're looking at? And it's these two. So designing and carrying out an investigation, particularly to do with the metal and the chemicals and that kind of stuff, and then analyzing the data. In other words, figuring out these are the results we're getting, and the reason we're getting the results are because of this, this, and that. And how could we change those results if we wanted to? In other words, change the resulting colors. And then every subject area not only has standards, but it also has essential questions that kids are encouraged to explore in those subjects. And these are the ones from my school, and they're very general as well. A lot of schools have very similar ones in terms of what are the essential questions in the specific field of chemistry. And two of them that stood out for me are how can chemistry predict the outcomes of chemical reactions, and what uses of chemistry can be found in everyday life. So those two essential questions are very easily looked at and kind of explored through this kind of art project that I'm looking at right now. And so visual arts is the same. We've got those 5 general standards, like I talked about earlier: creative process, elements and principles, critiquing, context, and skills and techniques. And the two of these that I think fit really well is the creative process, the planning, organizing, and problem solving, and then the critiquing. And those two targets, those two standards that I've targeted here are very similar, or they match really well with the ones from chemistry, as does the essential questions I'm looking at. So here these are some of our general essential questions in visual arts. And these 3 in particular, what's the value of planning your work and organizing the process, particularly what are the chemicals you're going to be using and what colors do you want to get, for example, for the painting you want to end up with the end. And what are the specific ways that visual looks can be created in order to create a certain mood or effect? In other words, how does color affect emotion is one of the ways. And how do lighting and color affect our interpretation of a visual piece of artwork? So here's really the core of the kind of stuff that we're looking at. So as I talked about before, STEM is science, technology, engineering, and math. And then STEAM, it involves the inclusion of arts in that. But it's not just fluff. It's not just adding something artistic onto it. It's really using one or more standards from science, like we've just looked at those, and we're looking at 2 of them, and one or more standards from art, which we've just looked at those 2, to explore essential questions from either or from both areas. And what I'm doing with this project is we're looking at essential questions from both of those areas. So it's really about this marriage between the sciences or the more academic core, what are considered to be core courses or fields, and the arts. So here's the task. So this is in terms of looking at this as a unit or a project. The idea is to implement a STEAM project by designing and carrying an investigation that does that takes the standards from science, those 2 that we talked about before, and these two standards from the visual arts. And you can see they're very, very similar. So designing and carrying out an investigation is very similar to the creative process of planning, organizing, and problem solving in visual arts. And analyzing data as well as critiquing are really side by side. And then we do this by exploring the essential questions from each of them that we've targeted. So the essential questions from chemistry, for example, is how can you predict the outcomes of chemical reactions? Specifically for this, we're going to be looking at the outcomes in terms of color and what uses of chemistry can be found in everyday life. Well, chemistry doesn't have to stay in a laboratory. It can be part of a creative piece of artwork, which is what we're doing with this. And then the essential questions from painting, what's the value in planning your work and organizing the process? And so you have an idea of what you want to do, but you also have to be flexible in terms of changes that happen. And especially if we're looking at blending with chemistry, sometimes you get unexpected changes. Then how do you adapt your ideas to that? And what are the ways that specific visual looks can be created to elicit or to elicit a given mood or effect? There's a whole, I think I'll put a link into it a little bit later. There's a whole idea of color in storytelling and how color can be associative or transitional, and how that really affects the mood and the emotions and can elicit those emotions, but can also portray them, whether it's an imagery or a film or a photograph or a painting. The effect is always the same. So what is the kind of approach that we're looking at here? And I'm just going to talk briefly on that. Actually, on the very bottom here, there's this link. And this is an excellent overview if you're interested in taking a look at it, if you don't really get or understand what understanding by design is, or backward by design, which is kind of an outgrowth of that. But really the basic idea of that is that first you look at what are the goals, what are the essential questions, and the enduring understandings that you want the students to get to through a project. And then working backwards, looking at the kind of skills and techniques you want them to lose and what to learn and use, and what the goals are. Then you decide, okay, what project can meet those ends. So you decide on what the project is going to be at the end, not at the beginning. And this has been a challenge for some teachers who are really locked into years of having decided, they're doing this project and then this one and this one, with no real kind of understanding as what's the purpose behind it and what are the students learning from it. So this whole approach of backward by design, I think, is excellent. And the idea behind it is that you're targeting the learning of the students rather than the activity. The activity has to be geared for them to meet that or to achieve that learning. And if it's not going to, then don't do that project. Do something else that's going to fit those needs. So really, like I mentioned earlier, this is actually what I was doing before with that chart that I showed you with the middle school and upper elementary school programs that I was doing earlier. And then one last kind of area that I think is really crucial to keep in mind, especially these days. In the last number of years, there's been a lot of light shone on this whole idea of bias and racism and exclusion in societies and cultures in many, many different areas. And one of the things that we're doing at the American School of Madrid, and I know a lot of international and American schools are doing, is this push to try to address ABAR, anti-bias, anti-racism, as regularly as we can, but not as an add-on, as part of the projects or part of the work that we're doing with the kids, and to be able to be aware and catch ourselves and to catch students when it can be very insidious when these ideas or beliefs or ways of acting kind of worm their way into unconsciously or kind of like without us realizing project that we're doing or assignments or things that we're talking about, conversations, whatever it is. And there's different ways to address that. And there's a huge wide range of issues there as well. Racism is one of them, but bias and exclusion are also very very prominent in a lot of different ways. And here I've listed a few different areas, and I kind of targeted these specific ones because the projects that I worked on, I tried to address a little bit each of those, and I'll talk about them a little bit later. Okay, so how do you develop the project then? What's the project plan, and how do you implement it? So this is actually kind of a zoomed in section of my unit plans with the program that we use to kind of document our unit plans for every unit. And so I've just kind of taken it from there, but we can see how this fits into it. So we're talking about this unit or this project is about STEAM, about trying to blend science and art. And so the focus is on chemical reactions, corrosion, which is what's happening with the copper, and oxidation, which is what's happening with the steel, and then painting and color theory. And then also, like I mentioned earlier, the subject, really the theme that we're looking at is the associative properties of color and imagery as they relate to racism, bias, inclusion, and issues. So this is where I've dovetailed the A-bar in with that. And the associative properties, in other words, what kind of colors or what kind of emotions can certain colors elicit in the viewer, and then how can you use those colors for what you want to do. So again, when we're looking at planning a project, we haven't decided yet what we're going to do. What's the actual physical assignment or project going to be? But we talk about what are the goals, and we want them. Really, the idea with this is we want students to be able to plan and react creatively and artistically to the use of chemical reactions produced by everyday household projects. So there's so many different ways that could happen. I've taken one route with that, but that's not the only way that these goals could have been met. Enduring understandings. So a couple of the enduring understandings taken from both areas is to understand that chemical reactions can result in specific visual and physical outcomes that are related to the elements of art, like texture, color, and shape, and we'll see that. And then taken from visual arts, understanding how both planning for and interpreting specific visual outcomes for chemical reactions in order to create artwork. In other words, if from the artistic point of view, you want to be working with a certain color theme, how can you create that color theme through the chemical reactions? And so you're talking about collaboration here, and this kind of thing can go across subject areas. For example, the science teacher and the chemistry teacher is much more skilled in terms of directing students in terms of how can you come up with those kind of colors you're looking at wanting to do than myself as an art teacher could be. So we're talking about collaborating in terms of colleagues and teachers as well as students. And then the essential questions that we've talked about, we targeted them earlier. So this is just kind of reshaping them as well. So those are all the essential questions, but all put together now that we looked at before. And here are the standards that we're looking at targeting. There's 2 standards from visual arts and the 2 standards from science. And then the knowledge and skills that you want them to develop from whatever it is you're planning for them to do. And so really it's the ability to plan a project that integrates both of these areas, chemical processes and artistic goals, and the ability to make adjustments to the chemical processes as well as to the artistic interpretations as a result of the changes in both of those. And so it's about being flexible, and it's about the art letting the chemistry influence it, and the chemistry letting the artistic goals influence that or direct it. And really, really crucial with this, which one of the things I mentioned earlier makes your life as a teacher much easier. In terms of assessment, you're not looking at assessing the final project. You're looking at assessing their learning in those standards. And so the assignment, the example assignment that we looked before in 3D computer animation, she was presenting her learning and she was being assessed in the 5 different visual arts standards. In this case, we're looking at, okay, a student's work in this case would be assessed looking at these 4 different standards. 2 of them are from the visual arts, the top 2, and the other 2 are from sciences. And so the student is being assessed in 4 different standard areas, but from 2 different component or fields. So here's the learning plan, actually. And this is a very common methodology used in terms of unit planning, and it's looked at in terms of where to. And this is really kind of a chart or a map for a teacher in terms of going through the presentation of a unit or a project like this, regardless of what the actual activity is. But just these general things of where you're going with this project or with this unit, things to catch their attention, experimenting, um, a little bit of formative assessment and evaluation as you're working with things, rethinking stuff, and then again evaluating it, and then making it very student specific so that every student is working at their level, and they're not all doing the same kind of cookie cutter type work. And then, oh, the very last one, organization. This is the actual project that once you've gone through all of that and you say, okay, now I have all this information. Now I know what I want the kids to learn. How can I set that up in a project? What kind of project can we do in order to cause this learning or encourage this learning to happen? And you could take a look at that in a little bit more detail. But what I've got written down there is basically for organization is basically, okay,